Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and thank you very much for the kind introduction. And I'm very pleased to be here with you today to speak about, at WHO, from the global perspective, how we really envision both science, but implementation science as helping us take that critical research so we can put it into policy and actually deliver care for people who need it. And as you know, this is also about HIV and its comorbidities, that this is just a brief overview of the epidemiology. HIV still is a major problem. We know that 65% of new infections are among key populations or their partners. It's an important problem for the Southeast Asian region and the Western Pacific region. So I think also some of the delivery challenges can be addressed through implementation science. What the good thing is that we have a lot of data now to show where we have gaps in the delivery of HIV care. And it's these sort of hashtags in the data where we know that perhaps implementation science can help us be able to deliver better. We have new global AIDS strategies as well as targets. And if you're following the global AIDS work, you'll know that there are now societal enabler targets. And again, these are places where implementation science and policy research is much needed if you're interested in getting into this field. So let me delve into what we see as important around implementation science at WHO. We think it's important to ask those important questions and then to answer it reliably. And certainly we've seen there has been a spectrum over the last 20, 25 years of when you have a really good intervention that sometimes it doesn't get implemented absolutely quickly enough to be able to have the impact. For example, the artemisinin-based combination therapies, very strong data to show that it's important, adopted within 5 years, has had impact on reducing mortality. Hepatitis B vaccine at the birth dose, for example, though, very good intervention, still not yet fully implemented around the world 25 years later. So why? Why is this so slow? And WHO addressed this when there was a time where there was a sense that our guidelines and policy development was not using data in a systematic way and relied heavily on experts. So we revamped our guideline development process to use what we call the GRADE approach. And in the GRADE approach, not only are we using randomized controlled trials and observation studies, we're highly valuing things like feasibility, acceptability, cost, values and preferences, ethics, equity, human rights. And all of those can be addressed through implementation science and need to be addressed that way. In the past, we really looked to the randomized controlled trial as the gold standard. And then for WHO, as we make new recommendations and policies, we pull that all together in meta-analysis. So that's super important to have. But if you have the best intervention and you don't know how feasibly to implement, or if the end users' values and preferences of people who need to implement and receive that intervention and the cost, you will not be able to replicate that randomized controlled trial to get that impact. So we focus quite a lot on these other areas in our research. And let me walk you through a few examples of how we do that. For values and preferences, for examples, we look at decisions where patient preferences or values are important. And sometimes if there's a really important intervention, but yet patients will not take it up or people will not like it, it may not become a policy. We also look for those high interventions and policies that will reduce death, reduce mortality, and look to see if we can reduce the price so that it can be equitably shared around the world. Great example would be the prices of antiretrovirals or the prices of direct antivirals for hepatitis. Started at $89,000 per year for a treatment, now down to less than $50. So those kinds of things driving that can then bring greater acceptability, feasibility, and then ease of implementation. So how do we think about putting implementation science in? We think it's important to do it in parallel with the randomized controlled trials, and more we're seeing research embedded into service delivery, into the actual clinical trial. We believe integrating values and preferences from the start, and you'll see that around long-acting cabotegravir, an example I'll show later. We believe looking at flexible and adapted designs are important, looking at cost effectiveness, modeling to support decision-making, and better approaches to appraising evidence for complex health interventions. What's that? When we want to say, we know sometimes what to do, use drug A, like dolutegravir, but how to implement it when you have challenges around that intervention is what we call complex health interventions. What are the service delivery approaches? And they may be multifaceted, and therefore the trials and the data may be a bit more complex, but that's where great implementation science can help us. WHO has put out an implementation research toolkit, both for workbook, for facilitators guide in 2014, and now have updated that again in 2021, where they look at the contextual elements in implementation research and use that contextual knowledge to study the processes to improve practice. And it applies this research to the real world context. So we want to see that what is a great policy from a randomized controlled trial can work in the real world. And here are some of the factors that handbook will walk you through if you're interested in taking this up. And what they have now is an online training. So I would encourage you to go on and see if this can be helpful as you start to think about your research. Helps you think about contextualizing the problem, engaging relevant stakeholders from the beginning, because that kind of research needs to be interactive and participatory, and find those solutions and then have the ability to put it back out, communicate it. Oftentimes, excellent implementation science and programs are done so well in one context, but yet they're not shared so that another context doesn't have to reinvent the wheel. So sharing and dissemination and writing those papers is really important as well. And if you have an important finding, bringing it to the WHO global guideline process. For us, when we develop our global guidelines, we know that we go from the micro, very small pieces and questions, and we try to put it into the macro, where we're addressing each piece of the 95, 95, 95, the strategies, the comorbidities, so that we can reach our targets of ending AIDS as a public health threat. But each of these pieces need a bit of research and a bit of implementation science. In my last, I guess I have 4 minutes or so, I want to walk through some examples that we've had. So many of you may know the story around dolutegravir. Clearly, it was a well-anticipated drug. People wanted to use it around the world. We looked at a network meta-analysis, sort of like this way to appraise the data. It was good for reducing treatment discontinuation, but very comparable for other things like mortality and AIDS progression for efavirenz. And we knew that we were going to have some challenges with implementing because of the neural tube defect signal under a trial. But you can see over time that we continue to work with our partners, USAID and others, to answer those questions. And those implementation and programmatic studies were critical to be able to fully implement the dolutegravir. And we're getting to a point now where almost all countries are starting to implement. And that's a really important example. Another example is WHO puts out a number of data dashboards where programmatic data can help those in the field be able to see how is the data implementing. Here's one for testing. And during COVID, we really worked a lot on self-testing for HIV, self-testing for COVID, and applied what was learned from HIV to COVID self-testing and to hepatitis C self-testing. Now, there's not a lot of data per se on hepatitis C self-testing in the community or big randomized controlled trials, but it was the implementation trials, the acceptability, the feasibility, and the ability to translate from HIV to hepatitis that allowed us to make that important recommendation. Again, we have multiple opportunities during COVID to do that self-care, whether it's self-collection for STIs, whether it's using virtual interventions. And those are the kinds of studies that have helped us actually now develop recommendations around virtual implementation. I'm going to skip quickly to the last example, long-acting cabotegravir. PrEP has been an important piece of being able to reduce new infections. And we see from the clinical trials that long-acting cabotegravir can be really an important game changer. However, we have so many outstanding issues. How to deliver it? Could there be a resistance issue? How do we do it in pregnancy and breastfeeding? How do we do best testing? Are there other populations where we can't use it? All of these questions are very important for implementation science, some of it going on right now, but it will come back to our guidelines so that we can improve our policies and actually change our policies in the end. So in summary, in this brief overview, we use implementation science readily and all the time to inform our guidelines, and it allows us to have the best quality standards for our evidence-based guidelines. For you doing the research, focus on the right questions, focus on the community who would need to receive this, work with stakeholders and develop that over time. Use that and look at systematic reviews to incorporate your findings, and certainly gaps in service delivery are the most important thing that we look to for research so that we can replicate what happens in a randomized controlled trial, what happens in a prospective study, and see the same good outcomes and impact on health in the real world setting. So with this, I want to thank all my colleagues and appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. Thank you.